All right. Good morning, everybody. Looks like we got a lot of background noise. No, it's not too bad. Okay. Let's see how it does. All right. So I'm going to be cleaning up some of the cloth details on this model. Already been sort of slowly plinking my way through some of the vest area here, kind of layering in a few more details, softening a few things down here and there, and kind of sharpening up lines. I really want to kind of sell a few of these areas that that I kind of had to carve in. I find that this is sort of the tricky part with a lot of this stuff. It's kind of finding that balance. I think I want to kind of soften this whole edge down, actually. Kind of finding that balance on the surface between sort of the detail that's been sculpted versus the detail that's been modeled, and just want to take a bit of time to kind of refine that down a bit. And I think what I'm going to do is just kind of go over these areas a little bit. Well, maybe more than a little bit. I mean, just looking at it, there's certainly plenty to do here, so I'll probably be going back and forth a number of different ways. But to start things out, just kind of smoothing out some of these edges here a little bit. I kind of over sharpened that edge. This edge is partially open, so this is partially physical, and then I decided like halfway through the building process, of course, that I needed to go back in and sculpt this higher. So I wanted this to be like a full panel, and I didn't build it in when I built it. This actually needs to be fixed too. I need to close these gaps up. This actually may end up being something that I try to clean out of the normal map later when I bake it, but I'm not entirely sure how I want to solve this area yet. But for now, I'll just focus on just kind of closing the gap up a little bit better here. Maybe I'll use the AccuCurve to help pull these corners into a better spot. I really find the AccuCurve helps a lot when you're kind of fine-tuning cloth detail in particular, because you're always, especially when you're working in ZBrush, you're always kind of losing your corners with this sort of stuff anyway. I mean, there's a number of different ways to resolve it, but I find just kind of going in with that AccuCurve to be a really convenient sort of solution, because it really helps hold those shapes, right? It really helps hold that sharp edging together a little bit nicer. I'll probably just overlap these a bit so that they're bit more even. Run a slight smooth over them to clean them up. Do it. I don't mind leaving the seam in there a little bit, but I just want it a little nicer than it was. See, still a little bit of leftover artifacting from the subdivs and from the original projection of the clothing. Just kind of refine all that down. There we go. That shape out a little bit. These have to line up too. It's probably better. Actually, I should probably pull this right down into here. Maybe I'll just do that real quick. Just let that kind of overlap a little bit so we can kind of hide that transition a little bit better. That to be as clean as I can kind of get it here. I'm just using the Move Topological brush for this cleanup. Make sure it's doing what I want it to do. Excuse me. That AccuCurve going again. I'm just gonna shrink this back in. See if I can pull this corner up. I'm definitely going to be using my subdivs a lot here as well, because it's going to be a lot more effective for me to manipulate the low poly. You kind of see I can kind of really get in here and pull these shapes out, but as I go back up the subdivs, they'll round back out. So this will probably be a bit of a layered process where I'll have to go back and forth a bit between the two meshes, or the two resolutions, I guess, really, the high poly and the low poly. You can see some of this is a little muddy too. Go back over that and just kind of refine it down. Just go up a few subdiv levels. Reference over to here actually so I can kind of see everything a bit better. There we go. I'd like to just bring that focal shift in a bit. This will help focus the brush a little bit better. They are sitting off the surface a bit, which is kind of what I want there. Just a little bit of distance there. See, this area is getting a little lumpy. Turn the AccuCurve back off here and just kind of clean that edge shape up a little bit. Really nice. Like, one thing I find that a lot of people tend to underestimate, well, maybe not a lot of people, but at least some of the artists that are kind of first getting into ZBrush. Hey, how's it going? I'm Soul Reaper, welcome back. But as I was saying, you know, one of the things that I find that at least artists first getting into ZBrush tend to struggle with a little bit is just dealing with sort of the lack of control that you get from certain features and tools, right? Like Dynamesh is really great for some things, but that topology is really going to make a nice difference in terms of like your ability to smooth out shapes and create like clean curves and straighten things out. Like smoothing something like this in Dynamesh may not really result in a cleaning of the mesh, but nice. I'm glad you're enjoying it enough to want to keep watching. Working on anything yourself right now, or just watching the live streams? Yeah, it's just one of those things. It's kind of, it's easy to underestimate, but like all of a sudden, you know, once you get line flow on stuff, it's, you know, smoothing things changes, the way things smooth changes. Like it can just make life so much easier to some extent. But it's also something that you can't necessarily get right into either, right? I've seen people struggle with kind of taking a base and really focusing too much on that as well. It's like, yeah, it's good once you've got that shape in place, right? Once you've got that foundation in place, but getting that foundation in place, you know, topo isn't necessarily the best for that. It can be really good for it, but sometimes it's just, you know, you still want that Dynamesh, you still want maybe that Sculptress tool or whatever early on, so that you can kind of control things and define things a little bit more carefully. Cool. Yeah, 3D's pretty broad. There's a lot there. VFX, yeah, Maya, ZBrush, right? All of it. Oh, thank you. Yeah, a little bit of a departure from the hand that I've been sculpting nonstop. So I used Marvelous. This was a really early attempt at me using Marvelous, so I wouldn't really consider this. Oh, thanks so much for following. I'm Soul Reaper. Awesome to have another follower join in. But yeah, I blocked this in Marvelous Designer. My experience with Marvelous is pretty limited. This is sort of the only major piece that I've done with it so far, but I really enjoyed it. I wish I had slightly more powerful machine to do it on when I did this, because I did this on my tablet. And it was definitely a little tricky with Marvelous Designer once it started to get more and more complicated with the layers and stuff, but it did the job, at least well enough. But I'd love to learn more Marvelous. It seems pretty powerful. And I always catch like tutorials pop up on my YouTube feed sometimes. Wrong move brush. Yeah, I find, like, you know, there's sort of two different ways to approach dealing with sculpting clothing, and one is sort of without the physical seams, right? You build it as one sort of solid outer shell, and one is sort of with the physical seams. And I don't know, I really find, like, despite the challenge of working with the seams sometimes, the result just ends up so much cleaner, right? Like, you can really kind of read the structure of the cloth a lot better, even at a bit of a distance. You can sculpt it, and, you know, stuff like this is sculpted, but you can definitely kind of, it's hard to not say that you can tell the difference, you know, a lot of the time. And I find that that's really, got a bit of the shirt sticking out through here. Let's just tuck that back in there. Don't want that to be seen. But I definitely find that that's one of those things that I really kind of aim for. Of course, when I did this, you know, once I realized I was missing pieces, like some of the seams through here, for example, I could have done in Marvelous Designer, but didn't. I just decided not to go back and fix them because it had already been such a hassle for me to get it out to this stage that when I went back to readjust the cloth, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to sculpt it. And that's kind of the other thing about Marvelous, right? Is there's so much sort of to the workflow. You know, doing things like the retopo passes and stuff, fortunately I can bypass because I'm doing this game res, and I'll have to build the game res anyway. But, you know, with the quadded mesh even, right, there's some irritating elements of the way that the topo runs and stuff like that. I guess I might try their other remesh shape type for the next model that I do, because I'm curious to see how it compares, but I'm not convinced that it'll necessarily help a lot. But it kind of fights me a bit when it comes to that same sort of thing that I was talking about with the with smoothing surfaces down on a subdivided model or on a mesh that's got topo, right? It's like if you've got topo that's working against you, then you are going to end up in that situation where you've got like these little just these little sort of issues with the sculpt, sort of these little problem areas that just don't quite smooth properly, or these areas that almost behave like a Dynamesh where you get these little pinches and things like that, right? And that's kind of the issue that I'm encountering with some of this surface right now because of the way that I built it, right? So gotta keep an eye on stuff like that, just thinking of different ways to solve that problem. Yeah, you can just get OBJs out of it pretty easily now. I don't know what it was like back in 2014. It's been I mean, I think I'd looked at it back then, but I don't think I'd had really any experience with it. But it's the export that I did was just OBJs. It seemed pretty straightforward for the most part. Wasn't really anything too difficult about it. It just kind of went out, and I just exported it just as is, and it seemed fine. Get a little bit more depth out of this brush and just kind of do a little bit of this, just a little bit of this sort of dimpling in here, maybe a few little wrinkles coming out of here. Just kind of break up those edges a little bit. Focal shift, widen the brush up a bit. Um, do I make only models? Yeah, I tend to have my focus in modeling. So, I mean, it sounds like you're doing visual effects stuff as well. So, are you using like Houdini and stuff like that as well? Um, if you hate Maya, I can totally understand that. I am I'm definitely all about the Maya hate. It's not the worst program in the world, mind you, but it's definitely not my favorite. But it is what it is. It is the standard that I still use it, right? I still do all my retopo and everything like that. It's just I'm not their biggest fan. Um, but Houdini, nice, yeah. I want to learn some Houdini too. I find it like, you know, it's like when you're picking up and learning things like that, it's always a struggle for me because, you know, it's like I really, you know, my at the end of the day, I still love modeling. I want to do modeling. Like I used to do a little bit more generalist stuff when I was working in Softimage. I really enjoyed working in like ice and tools like that, and really kind of being a bit more of a generalist. I found I was really comfortable in that tool set. But when we had to make the transition over to Maya years ago, I just kind of lost interest in so much of that. Just Maya doesn't make it nearly as fun. But tools like Houdini really kind of add another level of depth to it. The challenge that I have now is that, like, I'm so embedded in modeling. It's like, do I take the time to learn that stuff, or do I keep building my portfolio and working on my modeling skills? Because I think really that's what I ultimately want to keep doing, at least right now. You know, it's really my area of interest, my biggest area of interest, my biggest area of focus. So I can't imagine kind of not doing that. So it's always like, well, I could learn some Houdini or learn some of this or learn some of that. Even Substance Designer would be a great tool for me to like dig a little bit more into. I've always enjoyed playing around in that tool too. But and then it's like, well, or I could just make another character in ZBrush and keep sculpting or creature or do something different there, right? So it's like 200,000 tool settings. Why do people hate Maya? You know, it's not necessarily that I hate it. It's just that I've experienced other tools that I just liked so much more. Right? It's like when I came over to Maya, I was deeply entrenched in Softimage XSI. It was originally XSI, which was Extended Softimage, or Extreme. I think it was Extended or Extreme Softimage or something like that, which was the modernized version of the Softimage 3D toolset, which was really popular in the 90s, right? Huge tool in the 90s. It was the primary tool for things like Jurassic Park. If you're ever looking at that stuff, like that's all Softimage 3D. And then they basically all the major 3D software companies went through an iterative process on that, right? So they went and updated their tools for the coming generations, right? So this is where we get the transition into things like Maya, right? Autodesk, or not Autodesk, I guess at the time, Alias Wavefront turned Power Animator into Maya, or developed from Power Animator into Maya. Discrete or Autodesk switched from 3ds Studio to 3ds Max, and developed 3ds Max, and then I guess at the time it would have been Avid that owned Softimage. Originally Microsoft developed Softimage, and they built Softimage XSI, and then that was the tool I learned when I went through school. So, you know, way back in the early 2000s, that was the tool I picked up. And it was really a great learning tool, right? I found that, you know, I went from being sort of a hobbyist in 3D. I played and dabbled with 3D tools in the 90s. I used Hash Animation Master and Strata Studio Pro, which was one of the tools used on Mist and things like that. Like I'd been keen on the tool set, but I'd never taken any official classes really, and never really took the time to learn it well, and all that sort of stuff. And I found that like picking up tools like or picking up and learning Softimage and having someone teach me, it was really like a big change for me. But it also meant I could adapt a lot of the stuff that I had learned in my hobby skills to help others as well. And I was immediately kind of helping my classmates better understand the concepts that I understood, because I'd been learning it on the side for a long time. And I found just like teaching it was really nice. And I actually ended up staying in education afterwards and teaching Softimage for years. And you know, when we switched to Maya, when we switched to teaching Maya, I mean, part of the challenge, of course, was just learning Maya, right? We had to learn a new tool, and that's never, you know, the most exciting thing for people to do unless you're kind of starting out for like the first time or whatever. Hey, Sculpts, thanks for following. You know, whenever you're starting out for the first time, right? So for me, you know, the transition from stuff like Hash Animation Master into Softimage was a big deal, but the transition from Softimage to Maya was like, why am I doing this, right? You know, Softimage could do all the stuff that I needed it to do. It was a huge DCC app. They were still developing it. They were still doing great things with it, although it had just transitioned. I think at the time it had just been bought by Autodesk, which was, you know, a big red flag in and of itself. But, you know, Softimage Ice was an amazing tool, and it was just so user-friendly. And the experience teaching it to students was night and day, right? I used to cover modeling and rigging and some surfacing stuff as well. But even little things in Maya are kind of weird in comparison to Softimage. Not necessarily bad, they're just different, right? So, like, take the file node, for example, right? If I want to do multiple UV set setups, right? So if I want to kind of take my model and use different UV sets for different things, right? You know, in Softimage, in their version of the file node, all I need to do is take the node and apply, take the file node, and in a little drop down menu you've got like which texture set you want to use, and whatever geo the shader is associated with will show up in the list with a different texture set in it, and you can assign whichever texture set on whichever piece of geo you want, right? And you can literally do it differently for each different geo and all sorts of stuff. Really simple. In Maya, you got to go through the UV chooser and do all this other stuff, right? And half the time that stuff isn't even fully supported. I remember we were looking, I was on the mailing list for early versions of Arnold because I was really interested in Arnold. Arnold was a big render shift from Mental Ray, and Mental Ray was both the default for Maya and Softimage. And I remember like the Maya folks, you know, the Softimage folks loved, you know, they were one of the early test beds for Arnold. Arnold was developed a lot on Softimage in the early days, in the mid-2000s. And that's kind of when it was first sort of birthed, I guess, right? Early 2001 or something like that. And then over the years, it kind of worked its way into other programs. But at least that's my understanding of it. I could be a little off there. But anyway, the funny thing the one thing that really stood out to me was like the Softimage artists were trying to make sure that tools like that were supported, right? Like that their texture set setup and stuff was supported properly. And a lot of the Maya folks in the mailing list were like, what do you even use that for? Like, why would you need that, right? And a lot of and it's just like because Maya sticks that whole tool in like this little in this separate chooser, right? The UV chooser tool. You know, you end up with because they kind of separate it out so much. A lot of artists don't know what it's for, how to use it, and it's complicated to use. It doesn't always work. You plug something into the UV chooser, and it you know, if you throw if you try to link a UV to a certain UV set, if that file isn't plugged into the right input node, or if it's plugged into an input node that Maya's shader, like the reading tool, doesn't recognize. So like if I plug it into, say, let's see, what would be a good example? Maybe something like anisotropy on a shader, right? I'm plugging a map in anisotropy on the shader, and I want that on a separate UV set. There's a variety of reasons why you might want to do that, right? If I did something like that, and there's a good chance that it wouldn't even show up in the UV chooser. And the reason for that is because, of course, it doesn't know how to read the anisotropy channel on that specific shader. So you end up in this weird situation where like some tools just don't even show up, or some elements of the tool set don't even work with other elements, right? And you'd never get that in Softimage because it's just not connected that way, right? It's associated with the file node, so you just kind of read whatever geo that the file node's plugged into versus the separate node, right? And it's just little things like that across the board, right? It was a technique and a tool that was super easy to introduce to students in Softimage, and all of a sudden it's something that's really difficult to introduce to users in Maya because it's like 5 extra steps and it feels really advanced instead of being something that's really just simple and a drop down, right? And it's stuff like that across the board in Maya that really turned me off on it early on. Since then I've gotten a lot more used to it. I wouldn't say that I'm like the I'm certainly not going to say it's the worst tool on the planet. I just, I sit here and I think about Softimage all day, not all day, but, I compare it to Softimage and all I can think is, I miss the Softimage days when things were easier, right? It's the same thing with stuff like teaching IKFK connections, right? In Softimage, the IKFK or the IK tools are all built into the way that you build the leg or the joints, right? So in Maya, you lay out all the joints on a model, right? You just lay out your joints and then you connect all the rigging elements up to it, right? Whether that's going to be control curves and control objects, or whether that's IK and FK connections and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, there's still constraints and things like that you'll have to build in Softimage and, all that sort of stuff. But the way that they approach it is different because the IK is built into the joint chain. You have to draw the bones a certain way, but the downside to that, and I like it too. I like the control and the specific aspects of it, right? Where it's like in Softimage, you have to sit there and you have to keep in mind, I've got to draw the leg joint. And then it'll auto build the IK if I build the leg joint a certain way, right? And you want to do these 2 bone structures and stuff like that. So it's not limited, but it's something that you have to kind of think about while you're building the skeleton versus sort of setting it up afterwards. So it's kind of just front loading the question, right? But anyway, because of that, it means that it kind of removes that step later on, so you kind of just deal with it there, and then you don't also have to worry about all the configuration because it's all in the bone, so I don't need to worry about pull vectors and stuff like that. You can set that up, but it's built into the bone chain, and then you can just toggle the IK and FK off within the bone chain, so it's all built in, and then you're just linking that to other components, right? So there's some neat little things like that I just kind of got used to, and then you go and try and teach this in Maya the other way, and it's like you start losing people, and it just doesn't make sense to everyone anymore. I just thought it was like at the end of the day, it was just an easier tool to teach, and I think that's what really stood out to me. That's what really spoke to me about it when I was both learning it and teaching it, I guess. But it is what it is at the end of the day. So as much as I can say I'm not a fan of Maya, it's mostly in comparison to other tools like Softimage. And I'm sorry, I'm going on a rant about this for really no reason at all. This is like every stream is going to be me ranting about Softimage and talking about ice and their cool tools for doing all sorts of other stuff. The list goes on, and I've missed like half the chat. Let me scroll back up through here. Let's see. Oh my god. Yeah, tool settings, Maya, modeling, texture, and lighting all have settings. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to see the difference in those tools. I haven't used 3ds Max. I've approached the idea of learning it because it's something that I know a lot of game studios are using, and it's something that I've thought about just because I want to kind of I'm really into the idea of kind of really working or building game assets, right? It's like this whole character is going to be a game asset, right? I'm doing this all for the purposes of kind of building up my skill set in real time, but it's every time I look at it, it's kind of the same problem, right? It's like, oh my god, a whole new tool. It works very differently than I'm used to. It works very differently than Maya. I've started to get used, I guess I've been using Maya for like 8 years now, so you know, I'm definitely used to it, I guess, at this point. But you know, just kind of looking at it from that sort of daunting perspective, it's like, oh, another tool that I've got to go in and learn. But it does seem like it's got some interesting elements. I don't do a lot of inorganic modeling, so at this stage, you know, what I've kind of leaned into, and this is kind of what ended up happening to me as well. Sorry if I missed any other questions. I'm just going to kind of keep jumping in here, but the things that I use DCC apps, like the full-on apps like Softimage and Maya and 3ds Max, like the stuff that I use that for these days is just so oriented towards like 2 tasks, right? Like all I ever do now is like, oh, I'm going to retopo something in there, right? And Maya's retopo tools, while not great, I know aren't bad. It's probably all I would, you know, the first thing that I need to learn with 3ds Max as well, and I'm sure their retopo tools are fine also, at least from my understanding of it. They're pretty solid. I've heard good things. You know, I know that their use in games is good, and you know, maybe that's another argument for picking up things like Topogun instead too, right? Like, do I want to focus in on stuff like that, or do I want to just keep sculpting stuff, right? Like, do you really spend your time on that sort of stuff? And I do find, like, yeah, you know, it's a lot of the time the first tool that you learn is the one that you really latch on to too, right? I mean, it's just sort of the techniques and tools that it presents, right? It's hard to kind of go in and pick up a new tool. I heard that Blender has a Softimage plugin type thing that makes it look and function a lot like Softimage, so that's interesting too. Blend colors, no. Okay, KFK switch, yeah. That's one thing that I kind of got frustrated with Maya about the other when one of their updates. And this is a bit more of a side note, but they went and changed the way the hypershade kind of graphs by default. And I get it, right? It makes it more focused on the texturing side of things and the shading side of things, but I really miss sort of having access to the nodes really easily. Like, now I got to go in and change the settings so that it displays the nodes on other objects, because I used to use you know, the node-based rigging stuff in Ice and Softimage, and I really liked the idea that, like, I could take the hypershade and just like run math nodes through joints and connect things up that way. But it's like they kind of buried a bit of that stuff, and now you got to go in and turn on a bunch of settings to do it. Yeah, IKFK setups are kind of funky. Like I said, you know, it's another thing in Softimage that I really like the simplicity of, but it's really just about connecting things together. Even just the way that, oh, see, this is just gonna be me ranting about Softimage all day, isn't it? Even just the way that Softimage kind of connected things was, it just feels like it's too much. Even the way Softimage sort of connected things was neat, because it used like a picking system, so you didn't have to worry about what order you selected things in. You did sort of, but like it wasn't like you had to select them beforehand and then apply the operator, which you do in Maya typically, right? And I always thought it was kind of unfortunate the way Maya kind of designs their system. I mean, I get it to some extent that you don't necessarily want that that node system kind of in the forefront, especially the way that they've laid it out and set it up, but there's so much power there that you kind of miss out on because they hide it as much as they do. But you know, Maya is node based, its core is node based, right? So you know, everything that you do is about connecting nodes, and then they hide all of that from you, so you really don't know what you're doing half the time in terms of controlling and connecting things. But you get you can do so much more with it once you grasp that, once you can kind of really get used to accessing it, which I find is so funny, because you know, everyone's leapt over to tools like like Houdini for a lot of that effects work and things like that. And it's a, you know, it doesn't hide that from you. It really puts the nodes at the forefront, and it's done very well for itself because of that. I find that interesting in and of itself. Soften that fold down here. I really want to kind of create a bit more contrast in the way this shape kind of reads here. Just kind of bubble that out a little bit more. Like the fold kind of changes as it hits the material difference there. Yeah, there's a lot of great depth there, right? But I don't know. I'm just glad I don't have to use it for most stuff anymore. I guess that's just and the retopo tools work well enough that I can kind of get the job done there. So I'll use it to assemble parts and organize that side of it. I think that's why I ended up learning ZBrush in the first place. It actually ended up turning out to be quite the effective teaching tool, or motivational tool for learning other programs. That reading. That's not too bad. A little bit of these fine wrinkles in the middle of the shirt here too. I feel like this could use a little bit of extra detail. I don't want to do too much of this because this is more like a wool, so this is going to be a bit sharper overall. But I think there's just a few spots in here where the buttons are kind of holding the shirt in and stuff that I want to kind of get. I probably want to thicken this volume up a little bit too. Let's grab the inflate and just kind of add some volume to this area. Balance that out a bit. Because this transition, this section should be a little bit thicker. Let's see where that seam is too. Is that just something that I sculpted? I don't think that would be there. Let's smooth that out. Yeah, exactly. 2.5D program. Yeah, there's something about it. There's just something about it. I don't know, it just spoke to me as an artist, I guess, but and you know, sitting here looking at how companies develop their tools, right, working with different programs, seeing, you know, how often updates come out and things like that. I mean, there's still one of the most I don't know, prolific is the right word, but sort of you know, constant developers out there, right? Them and Allegorithmic have just really been knocking it out of the park with tools, features, and doing so without completely destabilizing the tool set. I mean, granted, I definitely say I get more crashes now in ZBrush than I ever have, but you know, they've done a good job at making sure that it doesn't not only that it doesn't get out of hand, I guess, but also that it doesn't completely impact my workflow most of the time, right? The auto saving, the quick save, the way all of that works has just gotten so much more consistent that I don't usually have to worry about it. Even if it does crash, I've lost maybe 10-15 minutes of work if I lose any at all, right? Little things like that. And then, you know, the benefit is that I get all these new tools to work with, and all these new areas that I can kind of work in too, right? I mean, I'm more inspired by by design work and more interested in designing, although I don't do a lot of it. I do enjoy it, right? Love to do some more 3D print work, but getting a 3D printer is a whole other thing. That's a really good question. When was the last time I saved? Probably far too long ago. Let's go in and save file. Save as. I'm gonna run out of hard drive space here. Like 2 GB save files. Oh, cool. Aketsu. I haven't heard Aketsu? Akitsu? Oh, that's not the right brush. Let me brush there. Just gonna kind of make sure that this sits a little bit more straight. This is another thing that I see a lot of artists sort of struggling with, right? Is like getting things kind of straightened out over a surface properly, right? If something's pulling and so on, right? It's funny when I was used to be when I was talking about clothing a lot on characters and we were doing a lot of hand sculpting or hand modeling, right? I'd always reference back to the idea of like clothing not clinging to surfaces all the time, right? Like a lot of people make everything body tight, or especially shirts and pants where it's like you've got gaps that you cross and stuff like that, right? So female clothing, right, going across the breasts or something like that, right? With a shirt and so on, right? But I always remember I used to reference back to an image of an artist who had actually sculpted sort of the detail of the bra underneath the shirt, and then ironically there was no actual like bra visible on the model, so it was like, why'd they put that in there? But it was a nice detail to kind of still see under the clothing a little bit, so I always kind of remember that when I'm thinking about this stuff, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I myself don't get too much into rigging anymore either. I used to really enjoy it, but I think the most that I'll like, the stuff that really interests me now is like blend shaping and like facial deformation stuff, but not really doing like rigging anymore. I find that it's just gotten so beyond what I'm capable of, or what I understand to do, like right now, what I've learned in terms of sort of production type stuff, that I don't even want to bother trying to compete in that world. That said, there's always demand, so if you can get into rigging, it's definitely a valuable field. Straighten that strip out a little bit more. Let's just clean up the other side of this shirt. I should clean up this shape a little bit. It's a bit big. Total call beginner's guide to character creation. That's nice. You don't hear much about books these days. It's all online tutorials and stuff like that. I don't think books make a lot of money, which is why I think they kind of went away in the early 2000s, or started to fade away back then anyway. As early as then, I can remember kind of seeing books being more common. In the last 10 years, it's kind of basically all but completely gone. But I still like the idea of having like a nice book, you know, a book to pick up and flip through. I mean, I've got a whole small library of books from the mid 2000s that I used to help learn 3D stuff. Yeah, there's some really I mean, there's some crazy stuff that people are doing with rigs, but I think so much of it's like, you know, are you doing muscle-based rigging? Are you doing, you know, how much joint-based stuff are you doing? How are you correcting for shoulders or legs? Like those are kind of the real problem areas, right? When you're dealing with rigging, or mechanical sort of joint structures that are complicated, and you need them to like lock on one axis and rotate on others to get things into position, and also still making it artist friendly, right? That's always the other side of the challenge. That side I kind of find interesting, right? It's like giving feedback to the artist the right way and all that sort of stuff. I always found kind of interesting as far as sort of the rigging side of things goes. Yeah, anatomy for sculptors. Yeah, I've got a few. I've got the mine is my favorite's definitely this one. I know the anatomy for sculptors stuff is out there as well, but this is Human Anatomy for Artists by Elliot Goldfinger. It's a great like book for anatomy stuff. And then there's the I know they've got those PDF ones for anatomy for sculptors. I think I've got the face one. For the facial anatomy and facial rigging and stuff like that. That's one that I'm looking to dig more into, because like I said, I really want to do more, I'd love to do more facial animation stuff and facial posing. I think it's one of the areas that I'm still pretty weak in, and I think it would definitely benefit me to kind of have that in there a bit more, have that in my brains. Crank the strength up on this brush, and now it's really bothering me. Oh, I forgot about this cloth transition. This probably could benefit from some additional winkling too. Let's go ahead and do this. Food thief rig. Oh, cool. I know there was a company whose work always stood out to me. I don't know if it's the same one or not, but like Mindbender, I think was the stuff that they used. I don't know if that was the name of the studio or not. It might have been. Mindbender was the name of the stuff that or one of the projects that they had done as well, though, I think. But their rig stuff, their like rig stuff was really crazy too. If I can take a look at this thing that you're talking about, though. Food thief rig. Oh yeah, that's actually Mindbender. Yeah. Yeah, that stuff's really crazy. Yeah, they had a few rig breakdowns that they've done in the past, but yeah, it's all like this crazy structure stuff that they do, and the mix up blend shapes and lattices and crazy joint structure and everything. It's really cool. Always love that stuff. Yeah, they've been doing that stuff for years and years and years. So they did a bunch of, I don't know what they call them. What are they called? The little things that play, little like network clips that come at the beginning and end of shows and stuff. Like they did a bunch of stuff for Cartoon Network, basically, and they had these little creatures that were very similar to that cat. Yeah, it was rigged up very similarly. Really, really crazy stuff. Vest is floating a little bit more than I'd like it to, but look at that later. Sculpt and remove, sculpt and remove. Just don't like the way that hair is shaped. Sit on the body a little bit closer. Yeah, for sure. I don't think I've got it blocked off or anything. Should be okay to share links. These atoms. Atom Spring. Sounds familiar. See, I've always got my scripts turned off. Oh yeah, I saw this stuff. Yeah, this was really neat. He's doing like photogrammetry stuff, right? So he's got like yeah, he's got the scan stuff that he's working from. That's really neat. Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I always wanted to do like a hand-built sort of fax setup. Just do all the blend shapes and connect it all up to a nice rig. But I don't want to do it in Maya, so. Maybe I'll do it for this character or something. We'll see. I'm tempted to. I don't know if I really have if I'll have the time or the opportunity, depending on, like, it'll come after I do a lot of the other presentation work, so I'll probably have this, like, hopefully posted on like ArtStation or something before I do all of that sort of stuff, and then see if I decide to take it further. I've got a whole other project on the back burner too that I want to kind of get back into at some point, so always weighing my choices, right? Back and forth on here, see if I can kind of balance this out with the other one. I spent a lot of time on the other side just kind of nudging these shapes to make sure they felt more even. It's little stuff like this that can make such a big difference. I don't want your model to look too lumpy. You know what? The one rig setup, like there's a rig setup that I'm really curious about, but I don't know. I know this. I haven't seen any like documentation on it, which is Snapper's rig. Um, and I know that studio's been working on that stuff for years, so they probably aren't gonna. I think they offer it as like a service, but man, some of the stuff that they do with those setups is amazing. I'll definitely have to save this though. Where's my bookmark button? There we go. Store that for later. Make sure I can check this out. Because this is like blend shapes. You know, that's the one thing that's kind of kept me from doing a whole lot of blend shape stuff, is that it's still not super common in games yet. Like, it's not something that studios are really taking a lot of advantage of. I've started to hear it more and more. Like, I know they used it on God of War and stuff like that, but to the extent that you'd use it in like a standard like effects or TV or film production, right? It's like, it's kind of night and day, right? The differences, because joints are so much cheaper, right? Because you don't need to store a whole new copy of the model. But maybe that's something that's going to get even easier. I mean, with the new Unreal stuff, it's even more interesting to kind of consider what happens when you start not needing to worry so much about your poly counts and loading those meshes in and stuff like that too. So maybe times are changing. That's one thing that I'm looking forward to, is more of my general, I guess I'd say maybe cinematic or effects oriented knowledge kind of becoming more useful in games over time as the tool sets sort of overlap more and more, and techniques overlap more and more. Yeah, the baked sims and stuff is really neat. I find it's funny that a lot of the, a lot of at least the VFX students that I work with, they don't always. There's a few that I think that have looked at like games and stuff like that, but it's actually a big part of video games, doing effects and particle work, right? And it's getting easier and easier to transfer that data over. I know a lot of stuff is being done in Houdini for games, and it's always just kind of interesting. Yeah, I want to know more about that map blending technique too, FLML. It's very intriguing. I mean, I know map blending techniques have been around for a long time. I remember they used a lot of it in the Tron movie. I know they did a lot of blending of displacement maps localized to different regions and things like that. I don't know how much they did with like color maps, like for skin color discoloration and stuff, but we're seeing more and more of that everywhere. Yeah, there's some really neat stuff. I know. I know. I'm really excited to see like more places start using their the sort of the projection, like the LED based sort of studio stuff that they showed for like the Mandalorian. But even just like the virtual production stuff is really cool. And of course, just more use for real time, right? I mean, real time is just getting more and more close to non-real time stuff. Be interesting to see what Unreal 5 does and how it works when you throw in even additional things, right? Like they're doing so much without ray tracing, and then you add that back in. What's that add to the mix too, right? Who, me? I have an ArtStation portfolio, if that's what you're asking. Let's see, I'll just post it in the chat here. Pretty straightforward link. You can see the, I guess, the work in progress state on this model in a few different locations on there right now. I don't have a lot. I mostly spend my time teaching, so most of my projects are fairly small and contained, lots of faces and stuff, because I end up doing those as demos for classes. But I'm trying to get more stuff finished these days, so this will be my first big project in a long time. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, I love Anna Carolina. She does some really nice stuff. Oh, really? Interesting. I didn't know that that was her job. Huh. Wish I was a little bit more in touch with the streaming community. There's a few streamers that I get to watch and chat with occasionally, but obviously depending on the work hours and depending on when they stream, my mileage varies with getting in touch with them. And you know, one of the guys that I used to love watching, Snoots, I haven't seen him in forever. I think I saw him pop into someone's stream once, long after he had stopped streaming, I think. But I do miss him. Hopefully he's just working. That's what I like to imagine. You know, he's in a studio somewhere developing back problems like the rest of us, back and wrist problems. In a good way, you know, a good way. You know, say what you will about the quality of his work. I know he was at the time he was streaming his character stuff. I know he was just trying to get into it, break into it, after doing years and years of prop work. But you know, just the streaming, the conversations and the discussions were really nice with him, right? Regardless of where his work was at, which I thought was still really solid. Right. I mean, the only other artist that's doing that sort of work that I see that does really nice stuff is Georgian, and he's a pretty regular streamer, I know. And then there's of course like So Much Monsters and Anna, but I don't get a chance to see those folks as often. I think Georgian's the only one that I really see regularly, but I find his streams aren't as relaxing to watch for me. I don't know why, but something about it that just stresses me a little bit more than I'd like. Yeah, Nimlot. Yeah, that's his. I think that's the name he goes by on. I know. I think I reference his work a lot to my students. His work and some of the guys that he really likes as well. But yeah. Unity won't be too far behind, I'm sure, or they'll have something that's similar or the same at some point. Although I guess it's hard to compete with Epic to some extent. I mean, jeez, the studio's crazy. I picked up Unity once, actually. It's the only game engine that I've really kind of tried to pick up and learn, but I got distracted by other things before I could really do much with it. Oh, cool. Yeah, I bet, yeah. Maybe I should just soften it. It's just too sharp. Just gonna let that smooth back out. Maybe even. Let's go down a few subdivs. I gotta fix this wrinkle. This wrinkle's been bothering me for forever. It's not one of the, I think it's based on one of the Marvelous Designer wrinkles, but I think I kind of tweaked it at some point and just haven't been happy with it since I started messing with things. I'll do that. Just let that kind of extend out a little bit more. Oops. Oh, nice. Yeah, I sadly didn't get into the idea of working in real time till well into getting more interested in modeling. Maybe that's just because I was always interested in video game cinematics, right? But the actual like real time stuff always felt so, I don't know, it had its own complications that kind of felt just so limiting that I felt I'd be frustrated a lot of the time. But you know, so much of that stuff's going away these days, right? So much of that stuff's all but completely eliminated. The B, I think the biggest thing for me that jumped out was when the workflow started to really change. So like what I mean by that is, like, years ago, you know, I would have just done all my hard surface inside of Maya, right, or something like that, right? And it's not my favorite place to do that sort of modeling, but it is, you know, it is what it is, and it's certainly like a popular place for that sort of work, right? But what I found is that as I got more and more into ZBrush, you know, I wanted to find ways to do more and more in ZBrush. Now, I'm no expert at hard surface inside of ZBrush by any means, but the idea of going back into Maya is less and less appealing for that now. The more I do it, and you know, again, there's certainly going to be advantages in some situations, or a lack of advantage in doing it inside of ZBrush, for example. But you know, the big thing that really stood out to me was that you know, with game work, I didn't need to worry so much about the topo that I ended up with, which was kind of nice. Now, there's still aspects of that, but just the retopo process for games compared to, say, if I had to build something that was like really clean, you know, I'd have to either do it straight up in Maya and not waste my time inside of ZBrush, or I'd have to retopo something, you know, that really took on a lot of the craziness that I was doing inside of ZBrush effectively. And just that idea kind of was daunting, right? It wasn't impossible. It was something that I'd always, you know, it's like, oh, you just kind of accept it. But now it feels more and more like I can kind of just go in and build inside of ZBrush game res, and then I'm done, right? And you know, the game res got to be done no matter, you know, regardless of how you're approaching the model, right? I can't build in sub D. I mean, you can build in sub D, but you know, I don't have to, right? And then I still have to build the game res even if I build in sub D. So it's like you're still doing that step. So it almost simplifies the process by adding the extra step, because then it's like, well, now I don't need to necessarily work in sub D. Maybe I will, and maybe I won't, but like, you know, I don't have to, which is sort of the big difference, right? So all of a sudden it's like, well, you know, maybe I can build the pistol inside of ZBrush, right? Or maybe I can build the weapon inside of ZBrush, or the prop, or the armor, or whatever, and either, you know, just build the game res over top of it, or maybe even get away with things like decimating it down or whatever, right? And trying to use that as a base, right? So, you know, that was really the game changer for me in terms of like the mentality of going from like, oh, you know, I want to work in visual effects, or in film, or in video game cinematics, or something like that. But you know, now it's like, well, it just, the workflow just makes all of that so much simpler. It's like, why even bother doing all that extra stuff? Now I can just kind of take it and stick it in real time, right? Now, of course, the baking comes with its own challenges, right? Certainly, plenty of things to consider when it comes to getting an effective bake out of a model. But you know, you kind of end up doing that in another way when you're kind of building stuff. So it's like, you know, it's just a trade-off, I guess, at the end of the day. But I think I just really prefer the trade-off from the side that I get it and working this way. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I don't know. Just ranting and rambling. Keep the stream going. The stream of thought, right? It's a live stream of thought. Let's do a little bit more on this side. I think I just want some puckering and stuff like that over here. Smooth. There we go. That's a bit much. Much too, actually. I can see a little bit of like twisting artifacting going on here. I wonder if that's from the mesh or something else happened there. It's smoothing fine, so it must be from like the low res, the subdivs or something. Stream of brain play, yeah, there you go. There we go. Just lift these edges a little bit. This probably isn't the most accurate depiction of how these seams would really be, but I like the depth in it. I'm just like getting that extra little bit of read on things. I think I'm gonna have to smooth these down a little bit more though. This wool just won't do that. Maybe I'll even grab my Smooth Stronger brush again. Where's my brushes? Smooth Stronger. So, everyone else having a good day? It's not too busy, too boring, too frustrating. Get that up a little bit higher. Oops. Flip my camera around there. There we go. This is the one downside. I took the That's good. Nice. Yeah, I know how that feels. One of the downsides that I did, I built this, obviously I did this in Marvelous Designer, but because I'm game resing it, I didn't bother building or retopoing the base mesh. And it's every so often it comes to bite me in the ass a little bit. There's these little turns in the geo here that just don't smooth very well. Fortunately, there's a fix, right? So you can use the relax on these areas, or even the polish kind of works, but I'll just do a little bit of relaxing in that area and see if I can kind of ease it out a bit. Maybe I'll go down to subdiv level. Yeah, that's true. That's true. It still counts. Not like you're watching someone, I don't know. I mean, even playing video games, you might be learning some stuff, I guess. But, you know, hopefully you're learning something interesting. Something other than the frustrations of learning new software and watching me sculpt little wrinkles and puckering geo into my model here. Let's bring that smooth brush back down and go up my subdivision levels again. Still trying to decide if I need another subdiv on this vest. I don't think I do. I mean, 13 million seems like it should be enough, but I always, you know, if I'm under like 50 million, I always wonder. It's like, did I take it far enough? I know that's like the worst advice I could give someone too. It's like, yeah, take your model to 50 million. That's when you know you're in a good spot. It's like, no, that's not how it works. But nonetheless, like, you know, I think my hand's at 40 million, the head's at 50 million, and it's like the more I start pushing detail into things, it's like, did I do enough here? Do I need another subdiv on this model? It's like, the answer's probably no, but, you know, you gotta wonder. Oh yeah. You know, you'd be surprised, actually. I mean, my experience wasn't great at 50 million. I worked on I did the head sculpt on a tablet. Right now I'm working on my desktop, but I've got a Mobile Studio Pro from Wacom. That's what I'm doing. Like, I'm using it as a Cintiq right now for sculpting, but I use it primarily for work when I'm doing personal work at work. So like I'll carry it into school when I'm teaching, and I'll use it for demos, and so that I can have a Cintiq with me when I run my classes. But when I'm in my downtime working on my personal projects, I'll use it for that too. Now that I've kind of got a little bit more of a permanent setup at home, I'm using my desktop more, but the initial build on this was all done on the Mobile Studio Pro, and I mean, that thing's got, you know, 16 gigs of RAM and like a dual core CPU in it. Like, it's not terrible. Now, I wouldn't say my experience at 50 million was great by any means. I mean, it got slow at times. I had to isolate parts of the face down every so often to kind of make sure I didn't have too much visible at once, and I kept losing my undos because the history would kind of it would run out of memory to store the history, so every so often it would just delete all my undos. Usually it would be okay, but every so often, of course, I'd lose it just at the worst time possible, like right after it drew in like a line, you know, when the lazy mouse bug would kick in, and I'd get like a diagonal line running across my model, and then I couldn't undo it, and I'd have to go back through and kind of like re-smooth everything in that area and re-sculpt it. But you know, despite the occasional issue like that, it did well enough. I definitely it was tolerable enough to get through the whole process. So you might be surprised. I mean, I've been really impressed at how well ZBrush works in general. You're going to definitely find delays. Like, working with layers was just a nightmare. Doing layers just multiplies the problems, because for each layer you're just like adding another stack of memory usage, because you're storing essentially a copy of your model, right? So that was definitely a tricky issue to kind of deal with, making sure that kind of was consistent and worked well enough. But you know, I've been impressed. I can definitely see why some artists lean more into doing HDGO. I personally, despite my poor ability to maintain a consistent workflow in layers, I prefer having access to layers if I can. So I find like using HDGO, just there's something about it that just, because it breaks that connection for me, it's like I'm very hesitant to kind of transition to it. But in terms of allowing you to work higher poly without eating up all of your memory, it's like there really isn't a better solution for it, right? So you might find that if you're struggling with higher poly counts, HDGO could be a really good alternative. My recommendation would be just to store morph targets, though, right? Use those morph targets to really help maintain your sculpt consistency, your ability to kind of go back and clean things up, I guess, ultimately, right? So that you don't use that while you're working. pull some of these. Oops, some big. Let's get a little carried away with that brush size. Yeah, morph targets work with HDGO as long as you don't leave the HDGO, right? So it's kind of like layers, right? Which is kind of unfortunate. It's the reason why, again, the reason why I don't use HDGO. With the HDGO, at least you can store the morph target once you start the HDGO, and then you can sculpt until you're kind of done with that, whatever it is that you're doing, right? And you can use the morph target still as long as you stay in the HDGO. I don't know if it'll store it if you come out and then go back in. I have a feeling it wouldn't because it doesn't with layers, but I could be wrong. There might be some greater functionality there that I'm not aware of. But yeah, I mean, at a basic level, you can certainly use morph targets with the HDGO. You just have to keep in mind you can't leave the HDGO when you do it. Or if you do, you'll lose that morph target. But it's still pretty useful. If for no other reason than to have it, right? A little bit more in here. Okay. Yeah, I think my biggest frustration so far has been that I didn't retopo the clothing. I think what I'd probably do next time is remesh it. I think that's what I'll do the next time I approach the clothing inside of ZBrush. Even for game res, I just remesh it so that I get a cleaner flow to it, because right now, like, the big thing that always keeps hitting me is, you know, I'll get like a little wrinkle, like a little bend in the fold or something like that I just don't like, and a lot of that is from, you know, the weird topo in those areas, right? So something will come out in the topology that'll just keep me from cleaning that effectively, right? Like, I can't just smooth that out. I have to go in and sculpt it back into shape, because the smooth will just kind of return it back, or exaggerate it, right? And I don't usually want that, right? I want to keep it nice and clean. So that smooth brush back in there. I'm just going to clean up these transitions around here. I could potentially. I'm a little nervous because there's a lot of overlapping pieces in this now, and there's a lot of like seams that butt up against one another. So I'd be worried that reprojecting it would cause some issues in those areas. So if I can avoid trying that, like, plus I've got it thickened already. I've got the surfaces double-sided, and I usually what I would do with the clothing and how I did this, how I actually did this was I took the flat mesh out of Marvelous Designer, and then I panel looped it inside of ZBrush. I actually do a hybrid of a few different techniques that you can kind of find online. Oh, that's interesting. Let's fix these inner corners, because we'll see these, right? Totally important. Most important thing to fix is the little hidden corners in your mesh, right? I'm gonna do it anyway because I cannot help myself. AccuCurve this sucker. Just pull these corners into place. Do I use ZBrush auto unwrap? No, I don't actually. I with the clothing, I'm actually just carrying over the UVs from Marvelous Designer. I'll probably try to hold on to that for as long as I can, and then maybe just unfold it inside of Maya afterwards. The topo for this should be perfectly fine for unwrapping. It should be really easy to UV this again. But I generally do my UVing in Maya. Yeah, sure, no problem. Oh, come on. Move topological, causing me all sorts of trouble here. Let's go down a few levels. Shifty. There we go. Acu curve to the rescue. Hold those corners together a bit better anyway. Yeah, Quadra, you know, as much as I can have my gripes about it from time to time, it works really well. I mean, it works well enough. I know I've encountered a few of my own students that can really struggle with it, but you know, once you get the hang of it, and once you kind of start using the shortcuts a lot, and you know what you're building, like if you understand what your topo needs to look like, which is probably the biggest challenge, like really getting a good grasp on topology. Which for someone who spent a lot of time doing like mainly ZBrush work, I could definitely see that being, you know, a bit of a transitional process in and of itself. But most of the time, like that's the retopo is nothing. And then, you know, I'll go in if I can get the UVs on it. You know, I'll just go in and unfold it with the UV tools. I would like, I'd love to see some more quick features for like laying out UVs more efficiently. I mean, I know they've got the auto UV tools, but some of the stuff that I'm seeing out of Rhizome UV is just really cool stuff. I want to kind of, I definitely consider investing in that tool if I didn't have access to Maya already. It just seems like it's some of those features for just straightening out lines and edges and kind of relaxing inside that seems, I mean, Maya can do it, but it's like 5 extra steps, right? It just seems like it's really quick to do that sort of stuff inside of Rhizome, and I'm really curious about that. But yeah, you know, Maya's Unfold 3D works really nicely. I'm glad they implemented that tool set, because without it, Maya's UVs were just horrendous. Their tool set's just scary to use. But it's come a long way, and that's kind of the point, right? I'll fix this transition. Just incorporate that right in there. But yeah, as far as UVs go, that's usually what I do on Unfold 3D. And I really like the big thing that made a big difference for me. You know, I don't know how many of you use Maya out there, but if you're not using the cut and sew tool, the 3D cut and sew tool, I think it's a newer feature that they added for the Unfold 3D toolset. But it's really nice, really convenient. If you're not using it, I definitely recommend checking it out. I remember when I first saw it, I tried it out, and I guess, I don't know if the version of Maya was really buggy or what, but it generally would crash on me or something. But you know, the version after that, I think it was like 2017 to 2018 or 2018 to 2019, the difference was night and day, and it's just like I wouldn't go back to doing it most other ways. Acu curve on here. Let's turn that off and just narrow that focal shift down. I always like this low focal shift, or high focal shift, small small radius, sort of large radius brush. It sounds like I'm saying like three contradicting things at once. I just really like bringing that focal shift in and nudging Geo around. Okay. Okay, shirt. Maybe I can use like the Organifier brush on this. Maybe I can do, that might actually work. Let me bring that intensity way down. I should use this to kind of add these really thin lines in. Maybe I'll do that. Let's smooth some of this out. Really don't like lumpy shapes. Get rid of those lumpy shapes. There we go. That looks a little weird from this angle too. Match it with the move brush. See if that helps. Yeah, better-ish. Anyway, where's that brush? How many subdivs do I have on this? 2 million. Oh, thank you so much, XA or Alyssa. Thanks for the follow and thanks for joining in. Hope you're doing well and enjoying the streams. I don't know. Maybe you're like me and you watch like 8 things at once. Sort of creasing across here. Some of these like let's blur this a little bit more. Blur. Ooh, I could use gravity on this. Let's do gravity. Let's go to strength. Add some strength in there. Oh, I should do this the other way actually. Let's do it this way. Just cut that in a little bit more. Really like using gravity a little bit when I'm dealing with like hand sculpted cloth. Kind of have to be careful because gravity works relative to your camera's position because ZBrush doesn't know what up is. I mean it does, but it doesn't. It's weird. A little bit of overlap in that shape. Yeah, so for those of you that aren't familiar with the gravity tools, they're part of the brush menu under depth. And they drag the brush stroke up or down relative to your camera. And by default, it's just, you can see there's like this little pencil icon that points downwards. What is up? It drags the brush stroke downwards. So as I apply it, you can kind of see it just sort of pulls down a little bit. So you get more of an overhang one way or the other. The more strength you add, the more weird it kind of gets. So you got to be careful not to crank it too high, but it does pull geometry sideways, which can be a little bit complicated to use sometimes. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but one thing that I've really kind of considered is how you're exporting out your models. This is sort of a bit of a side rant in and of itself, but when you're dealing with certain export methods, right? If I'm doing like a bake from, say, the multi-map exporter or something like that, I'm doing like a normal map or a ZBrush or displacement export out of ZBrush. I want to be really careful about using brushes that pull the geometry sideways on my final meshes. So this is usually why I don't use Damien Standard with the pinching. I'll usually deactivate the pinch, which is the brush modifier setting under the brush. Under brush modifiers, so that brush modifier slider applies the pinching effect to the Damien Standard brush. So I usually deactivate that and just use the alpha. And I usually try to avoid gravity on meshes that I'm working with in this for the same reason, at least to some extent, because if you don't influence the base mesh, the displacement can't recreate the movement correctly unless you do something like an adaptive bake. So if you're using like your multi-map exporter, for example, and you've got the adaptive mode on, then you'll get a more consistent result for that. But you also introduce baking errors because this is more of a raycast method, so it's reprojecting the model. But anyway, that's kind of a side rant. Since I'm dealing with wrinkles and I'm going to be game resing this anyway and baking it separately, this will be perfectly fine here. But you know, it'll kind of drag. If I hold Alt and carve inwards, it'll actually work against the direction of gravity and carve the cup underneath a little bit, so I can kind of use it to lift the undersides of wrinkles a little bit. But ZBrush doesn't have a sense of up as an orientation except relative to the camera for gravity, at least for the purposes of gravity. And you see it in a few other places. If anyone's ever used fiber mesh before and you've slid that gravity slider around, it actually drags the gravity based on the direction the camera is oriented, which you can use to your advantage. But this also means that you may want to kind of tilt your camera around to kind of get the directions working, which incidentally is actually one of the main reasons why I don't use why I use the XYZ camera, why I don't reorient my camera. You can see here I've actually got the rotate on axes up at the top, and I've got XYZ and Y here, but the reason that I usually stay in the XYZ, I know some people prefer the Y mode, is because I'll often need to twist my camera around at weird angles, specifically for brushes like this, right? So that can be a nice little thing. I like it a lot for cloth folds and stuff, but there's plenty of other places where you could use it too. Welcome back. We were just talking a little bit about gravity on your brushes, not in general. I just realized these two meshes are separate pieces of geo, so I can't sculpt on the other one. I split the sleeves off the shirt because I needed more subdivision levels, and I didn't want to delete the interior of the shirt, because I don't know why I didn't actually want to delete the interior of the shirt. Probably should have, but whatever. It's done. I'll probably have to delete it at some point anyway, because I don't want it to bake. Fix it at some point. Sharpen a few of these up a little bit. I think these armpit ones are a little weak in here. And see how that gravity effect kind of gives me a nice little pull. Kind of reorient this a little bit. Maybe I can do just a fine one through here, a short one. Blend that in a bit. You know, I haven't seen that one. You know, it's I haven't had the chance to get through all of the ZBrush Guide stuff. I do like their work. I picked up their skin pack before I started doing all my skin manually. But I guess their skin pack is actually for doing it manually, so maybe I should kind of reincorporate it into my brush pack. But no, I haven't seen it. Yeah, I imagine he does. He's got all sorts of creative little tricks and techniques and brush. I wish I understood the brush system as well as he does. That's kind of the thing that I was sort of am a bit more in awe of with his understanding of how to use those tools. But most of my hand sculpting cloth knowledge comes from my old Bern Hogarth drawing wrinkles and drapery books. And reference, right? Lots and lots of reference. So. Right. Let's go back in and add those little brushes. Yeah, he really is a ZBrush ninja. I can agree with you there. Let's do a little alpha work on that as well. Reintroduce a few of these compression. Where'd my reference page go? There it is. That's not going to work. Let's try that one. It's too strong. That's better. Just want a little bit of shape in these areas here, just to break that up a bit. Oh, did I? What is that? I did switch that off. Oh, I don't have it in here anymore. That was the dang standard one. Okay. Yeah, of course. Of course it's gonna do that. Ah, whatever. I'll just leave it like this for now. Let's go. Time is it's 12:30. Starting to run out of time here. What else do I need to really do on this sleeve, though? I think I got to redo. Well, I guess I don't have to redo. I probably have to enhance all of this stuff here. I want to get in here and really kind of hit this area with a little bit more. Smooth out a bit of the transition here. And then give it like that overlapped feel. So just kind of take out the depth, take out the sharpness, I guess I should say, and just keep the heightened transition. It actually is a little low res in here. Let's add another subdiv to this. Why not? Do I have no intensity on this brush? What's going on here? And oh, it's just the alpha. Alpha. There we go. That's better. Yeah. 3D Gladiator. No, I haven't heard of 3D Gladiator. YouTube, Twitch, or other online resource. Huh. Sully sounds familiar. Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah, I've seen some of this before. I think I've seen the fold brushes and stuff, the cloth brushes. Maybe I should grab them. Actually, I probably have these somewhere. I haven't used them in a while, but... Huh, okay, cool. I bet he is. Wait for the... I gotta reload. Oh, nice. Hmm. Interesting. Free access? You just gotta sign up? That's not bad. Oh, I gotta be careful. I always remind myself, when something's free, the product is you. But that's very cool. I'll have to check that out. It's always nice to see some of these older names and faces kind of still around in some way, shape, or form, right? There's so many of these resources that I just don't even know about, too, right? Like these little websites and things like that. Nice. Oh, am I crashing into the arm? No, not. Okay. Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Yeah, maybe I should do the same. Oh, I really like answering questions. I don't know what it is. Just get distracted by it. I think it's just because I teach full-time, but I say full-time while I'm sitting here sculpting during work hours, but I don't know everything either, so maybe that's a good idea. Throw in like a little links and resources and stuff like that. I like that idea. starting to get close to my time here. Make my way back to working. Let's see, is there anything else I can kind of wrap up? Maybe I don't really like that shape. Maybe do this. Maybe that makes more sense. Split it both ways and just kind of tie that into there. Probably better. Yeah, ZScript is definitely one of those things that I wish I could find an opportunity to. Well, you know, I probably have an opportunity to learn. I just never can think of what sort of things I actually want to script versus, you know, all the other things, all the other ways I can kind of handle a problem. But I did come up with something, and now I've forgotten it inconveniently, right? I was thinking, sitting there one day, oh, that'd be a really good thing to script in. I do that all the time. I know, I guess So Much Monsters is always doing that sort of stuff. But I had something that I did on a regular, that I've been doing on a regular basis, that I was just like, oh, that'd be great to make a button for. And now I can't remember what it was. I just can't. It's gone forever. Or maybe it's not. It probably won't be gone forever. I'll just remember it when I do it again. But anything that kind of speeds up your workflow in that way is so worthwhile, and that's really where that scripting becomes so valuable, right? Take those repetitive tasks and just offload them. Yeah, it really is. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm gonna do it that way anyway. Tie that together. Maybe I should. Simplify that shape down a bit. All right. Well, thanks so much, Game Art 101. Thanks so much for the follow. And thank you to all for joining in, chatting, and just hanging out. It's always a pleasure to be here. I hope it's been relatively interesting and entertaining. Certainly enough to continue to keep you around. Look forward to doing this again. As always, my schedule is hit and miss at best, unfortunately, but as it is, I tend to be around Fridays and Wednesdays on the West Coast mornings, so somewhere between 10 and noon. But a little bit of a limited schedule, but overall gives me bits of time here and there to continue to make progress on my model, which I look forward to continuing to get closer and closer to being able to game res it and texture it up in the next couple weeks. So looking forward to a little bit more of that. Yeah, he really did go nuts with that stuff, didn't he? I got to get my hands on more of that stuff. So again, thank you so much for stopping by. I'm gonna wrap it up here and give it a good proper save. And of course, I encourage all of you out there to save your work as well. And then I'm going to move on to doing some of my proper job work, which will be working with some students. So I gotta log off here and call it a day. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again to all of those of you that are here to join in on the chat and who subscribed or not subscribed, followed, and all that sort of stuff. I look forward to seeing you again and doing some more of this, sharing some more of my work with you and time and chatting. Cheers. Have a good one.